What does it mean to speak? The following discussion examines two understandings of speech. On the one hand, we have a double account that is today orthodoxy in schools throughout the modernized world. On the other hand, we have an account of what is here called a Platonic, an ancient philosophical, poetic understanding of speech that at first is likely to strike us as abstruse, but that as we question or rise above modern views or prejudices, is likely to make eminently sense. On our first sheet, we find represented the currently standard view propounded, even on a most pedestrian level, as scientific. On the left-hand side of the sheet, we find the so-called subject, in whose field of vision stands a so-called object. This object is, as the term says it, something seemingly thrown, cast over and against the viewer. This viewer, the so-called subject, is subject to the object, or objective world. He is, in an important sense, passive, even as he may be seen as trying to escape his predicament, to become active, or to incorporate the activity of the object. The subject sees the object, he receives it, but no sooner has he received it than he or she, here we have a girl, construes it, then she tries making sense of it, most notably by translating it or transposing it in speech. Now, this conversion of something given as a whole into speech is not merely a copying of an image into another. The subject is breaking down something accepted passively or as static into a movement, an articulation. The image is converted into speech. The apparent whole is converted into a movement, trying to reconstitute the given image. There is an overlap, as we see here. The subject is supposed to try to speak in order to reproduce the objective. Speech, then, is supposed to give us, or be, the history or rehearsal of the history or prehistory of the objective. Through speech, we produce the objective ourselves. We become, in this sense, creators of the objective. We master it, if only in words, or, as we say, theoretically. We're now ready to apply what, in the highest sense, we might call our scientific theory to the pre-scientific world, the world of empirical sensory objects. The theory is here a consolidation of speech. At first, at least, it is supposed to be descriptive rather than normative. But whether it is truly descriptive, whether it corresponds to what we call facts or not, is something that must be tested. Only then can we prove a correspondence of word and object of sense. This correspondence is usually, if not always, only partial. We strive for true or pure objectivity without ever obtaining it. What we achieve is only greater or lesser overlap between speech and vision. So, a partial correspondence. What makes our speech scientific is not its perfect objectivity, but its integration into a process of striving for objectivity and verifying objectivity. Now, we have seen that speech is supposed to be descriptive, but clearly there is a normative dimension that comes into play. How it does, we see on our second sheet. On the left-hand side of this second sheet, we read the word romanticism. The romantic or subjective idealist dimension of speech is integral to what schools teach today. Integral, although not obvious or clearly stated. Let us see why. Here we find a subject whose vision of an overall violent, irrational world, a clearly pre-scientific world, is received as a motivation, a mover, to bespeak a world of words that, far from attempting to replicate the objective world, creates another one, a usually antithetical one, an ideal or better one. A dream, a world of values, a dream world. I have a dream, says the modern. This dream is supposed to be normative, at least in principle or in itself. It carries the weight of an ought, of an imperative to which we try to make the objective world conform. The ideal is eminently useful, then, since it is meant to be applied to change the world, that is, to lead the objective onto a path of idealization, to set the objectively irrational or violent on the way to becoming more and more dreamlike, as we wish the world to be. A world for us, by us, through us. A dream world. Reality as virtual reality. Falling short of a full correspondence of virtuality and reality, of words and things, things and words keep influencing each other. Objects move us to create alternatives that, in turn, influence our vision. We see through our dreams, even as what we see moves us to dream. Perhaps, then, the objective is begging for our intervention, for our converting it into a dream, or into our recognizing it as a dream. Not merely as any dream, but as our dream, a world of our free making, a spiritual world. The affinity of our school learning to the teachings of Hegel, the German philosopher, is unequivocal. Something in the objective, material world calls us to constitute a spiritual world, which in German is Geistwelt. Marx spoke of a realm of freedom, Reich der Freiheit. The creation of this purely human world, this purely historical world, requires a material, objective world as fuel. What Descartes speaks of as res extensa, extended matter, is what its overall underlying propelling element gives us, even that through which we are given. The objective is somehow given to us as a movement that moves us to set in motion a world of words, a world of things made by us freely, thus things of the spirit or spiritual entities. Spiritual or free movement is supposed to advance material movement, not merely, however, to remain in itself as mere verbosity, but to establish itself as an all-inclusive, all-welcoming world, a universal cradle, entailing the exhaustion of the merely objective or material, the mechanical. This exhaustion is achieved through or by the application of the ideal to the real, whence the rise of virtual reality as consummate reality, of the world as pure value, where everything is equally valuable or accessible. It is clear, then, that only at first glance are our public or state schools inimical to Romanticism, for our schools are occupied primarily with setting the stage for the Romanticism or subjective idealism exposed here. The stage is set by persuading us of the scientific or certain character of the belief that speech imitates, as a matter of fact, objective factual reality, that in speech we reproduce objects of sensory perception. The overlap between speech and vision is merely preliminary, for in establishing an image of the objective, the subject has set the stage for the attempt to replace the merely objective with a freely objective, or the product of art, as opposed to nature. Imitation is not, in other words, an end in itself, but rather one step in the direction of the replacement of the given into the freely made, of the passive into the active. Taken in and of itself, the world of words does not merely imitate the objective world. The imitation our schools persuade us of is merely a provisional manner of considering speech, which, in practice, produces a model that does not merely seek confirmation from the objective world. What it seeks is to replace the objective. In this respect, the world of speech, the ideal world, is to be understood as standing outside of the stream of objectivity, precisely as we see here on our second sheet. It is time, however, to turn to our third sheet, where a Platonic understanding of speech is spelled out. The account that follows is the most demanding to our comprehension, especially given that it treads against the grain of mechanical conceptions of speech that we're used to, conceptions of vision as well, and for that matter of the physical world. We are so used to considering the physical as a machine that the only alternative we are likely to fathom is an irrational or magical-like one that makes no practical sense. What is at stake at present is to seek out a third alternative, one that makes practical sense, even as it departs from mechanistic readings of physical necessity. What do we see on our sheet? What is seen here is precisely what is said. There is a natural or pre-scientific coincidencia, or coinciding, of the world of words and of things. This does not mean that we eat words or that an apple, say, is a mere word, but that words are none other than the things our misconception of words, or words in our misconceptions, leave out. The viewer is no longer, or rather not yet, conceived as subject to an object, but as an actor, a poet involved into the constitution of appearances. What our schools regard as material objects are poetic forms that stand both ontologically and epistemically between us and what is here designated as mind, the eye in the circle on the right-hand side of the sheet. This I must be the essence or absolute center of the poetic actor, so that in a provisional manner of speech we may consider appearances as illusions, constituted through us, even as we partake in them. We are, in fact, placed within the poetic world, a world not merely of poetic fabrications, but of poets as well. Otherwise put, we are poetic fabrications ourselves, fabrications of mind. But this mind, hypostasized here, must be none other than our mind, of that which is mind or in itself within us. The real poet, the poet who is not projected within the world it creates, is a thinker of ideas, a mover of forms within itself. A thinker whose movement is internal or self-contained. For thinking is motion within itself, complete or perfect motion. Motion that is not compelled to depart from itself, to lose itself into its departure, to refract itself into projected fragments of itself. The world of appearances is then, only provisionally speaking, a world of illusions or bodies. In itself, it is a world of eternal forms, forms constituted within thinking itself, noetic forms or ideas in the Platonic sense of the term. Finally, let us note the movement to and fro of the constitution of the poetic universe. The path through which we see coincides with the path through which we speak. By the same token, the path through which appearances are produced coincides with a path through which they return to their source. They descend and remount to the mind. Yet, again, the katabasis, the descent of mind into appearances, proceeds for us against the grain of the anabasis, or remounting, from the visible into original invisibility. The mind descends into appearances unreflectively, whereas we, as imperfect minds, must recover the reflective movement in order to retrace appearances to their source, or creative ground of intelligibility. What is done unreflectively is, as it were, to be undone reflectively. Yet, we are incapable of gathering the visible back into the invisible, negating appearances entirely, apophatically. Our ascent to the invisible world cannot do away with appearances. Apophasis needs kataphasis. In order to rise to the invisible, we must examine the visible. We must reflect upon the unreflected. We can return to ourselves as if we were the mind originating the visible. We can partake in mind by doing reflectively or gathering within our finite reflection what mind produces unreflectively. We discover mind, the invisible, within ourselves by engaging with the visible, by being to the visible what the invisible is to itself, by caring for the visible as much as the invisible cares for itself, by examining the visible as the content of mind. Our thinking does not replace or attempt to replace thinking in the absolute sense, but is, if only mysteriously, thinking in its original sense. Thinking in itself is not responsible for its projections. It is thereby closer to our poetic thought than it is to any historical reconstruction of appearances. Finally, our thinking being poetic, in the respect that it encounters the world as its content in the light of thought's perfection, it does not attempt to replace thought's perfection, but to witness it, its mystery, through its own activity. The world of art is not supposed to replace that of nature. Freedom is not supposed to replace necessity. No progress in that direction. Instead, we have a lingering, permanent tension between freedom and necessity as two facets of the identical reality, at once poetic and metaphysical. However, permanence signals necessity. Freedom, therefore, depends upon necessity. Unreflective necessity is the basis for freedom. Yet, the unreflective necessity of the constitution of the poetic world from the side of a transcendent mind is not mechanical. Nature is not a machine. It does not move blindly or aimlessly. Neither does it determine the human. The metaphysical eye does not preclude poetic freedom. In constituting the world that we see, the unreflective world, the metaphysical eye leaves space for poetic reflection, for a movement of return, for a thinking that is not merely in itself, as is the thinking of the metaphysical eye, but that takes appearances into account. This thinking that gathers the visible into its movement, a noetic movement, is the substance of poetic freedom, of human liberty. The natural world, or the world of natural necessity, is an incomplete world, then, a world that is not gathered back into its source. As the metaphysical eye projects itself into the world of ideas, it invites a poetic intervention. It leaves the door open to the permanent possibility of gathering the world of ideas into a human or poetic whole, an imitation of the metaphysical eye. Now, permanent possibility means, in effect, that the poetic exercise is to be renewed at all times, that it is never once and for all, but that it is a way of life, a liberty to be exercised over and over again in ever renewed fashion, if only always in the light of a higher necessity. So, nature is never extinguished by the poetic. In completing nature, poetry in its essential mode of reflection, does not dispense with metaphysical necessity. In humanizing or civilizing the natural, we merely reflect the metaphysical eye. Our life bears witness to, or manifests, what in Platonic terms is divine providence.